the erosions of freedoms. Meanwhile, Donald Trump's claims that U.S. intelligence believes China's forces are being mobilized at the border. Let's speak to Tom Grundy, editor of the Hong Kong Free Press, who's been on the front line of the action at the airport. Good afternoon to you, Tom.
Hi there, thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. Nice to have you with us. Let's just remind, it's one of those stories, isn't it, that goes on for a few weeks and you sort of lose sight of how this all began. How did this start? What's the main contention here?
Oh, you could go back decades to the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong.
I'm sure you could.
But this, of course,
is all specific about the autonomy of Hong Kong.
That too. I mean, it started with a murder case in Taiwan that triggered this debate over having an extradition law to China. But beyond that, it's really evolved into Hong Kong's original sin, I suppose, when it comes to its universal suffrage, one person, one vote, and Chinese interference. These kinds of themes that for decades the pro-democracy movement has been fighting for. And just over these 2 months of protests now, almost daily, certainly escalating each weekend, we've seen these demands evolve into demands for democracy and for a full investigation into police misconduct. So,
And is this also, is it kind of coming to a head, Tom? Because obviously when Hong Kong was given back from the British, etc., it was meant to be this, 50-year rule of, we leave the place alone for half a century. And many people believe in the spirit of that, or in fact the actuality of that, as being completely usurped.
Yeah, so people often talk about death by 1,000 cuts or a slow-boiling frog when it comes to Hong Kong's freedom. It's press freedom, academic freedom, freedom to protest, press freedom, which we were set up at our news outlet as a response to that situation. But year by year, things have worsened when really for 50 years up until 2047, as part of the agreement to hand it back to China from Britain, it was meant to be left alone. So in some ways, these protesters are conservatives. They're not asking for huge, color revolutions, as the pro-Beijing camp have put it, state media. They want to see those freedoms that were promised to them maintained, and for the status quo to remain. So
there is if you like, a spectrum of issues now that have manifest from these original problems. I mean, where are we now? I mean, you talking to us, for example, Tom, you're there in Hong Kong. Are you in danger as a journalist of being seen to even talk this way? Has it got that bad?
I don't know. I mean, I set up this English news outlet, 4 years ago. I'm kind of believe it when you see it, in terms of us, being followed or anything like that. I don't think we're really at that kind of situation. You're a little bit more under the radar if you're in English as opposed to Chinese. But, wandering around the airport yesterday in what has been days of generally peaceful sit-in, it's really turned now onto police misconduct. And you're just seeing screenshots, videos and posters hitting out of the police. Trust completely broken now in the forces. Sure. Just as I was waiting on the phone for you, I'm seeing reports now of tear gas in one of the poorest districts of Hong Kong, Sham Shui Po. They're calling it a tear gas buffet. And that's some of the signs we saw at the airport yesterday. Welcome to the city of expired tear gas, because they're using tear gas that's not even within date. We'd prefer the fresh stuff, please. So even in my own neighborhood at the police station here, which was besieged by protesters, them throwing bricks into the grounds and firebombs in a couple of cases, there must have been over 100 canisters of tear gas thrown. I brought back a souvenir to the flat as I emerged from that with the gas mask that we've been wearing in our news outlet. And so just remind us anytime soon either.
Sure, and just remind us, Tom. I mean, for those who don't know the political terrain of this area, what is happening in terms of the Hong Kong authorities as distinct from the Chinese? What's the deal there?
Well, there's always this sense that the city does not have leadership and representation of Hong Kong people. It's more that the chief executive, as she's called here, the leader, represents China to us. And you can see that she may be under pressure at the moment to douse these protests. I know a Reuters journalist on Tuesday asked her very directly, yes or no, do you have the autonomy to fully scrap this extradition law? And she dodges the question. We're stuck in this sort of cycle whereby all the government is able to do is, rather than give any concessions, condemn these protests. And each weekend they escalate. And that triggers more condemnation from the local government and from Beijing. And it just continues, onwards. Beijing, on the other hand, is a lot more forceful with its language. Its latest line is that this bears elements of terrorism. You might see how that would be beneficial to any government to give them carte blanche to suppress these things. But at the moment, it's being left to Hong Kong to try and sort out. But nothing's really going to change. We've got, in the coming weeks, we've got protests for Friday, for Saturday, a huge one planned for Sunday, and for all the coming weeks. So no movement on each side. It continues to be a very hairy situation.
Just a final point. Is there a sort of voice of reason within all of this? Is there any kind of political figurehead that is sort of able to perhaps kind of galvanize some kind of middle ground here between protester and government?
No. Everything is basically in the same way that there is the spectrum, from the Democrats to Trump, from Remainers to Brexiteers. Everyone is in one camp or the other, generally speaking. And the other issue with your question there is that it is a leaderless movement. It is, particularly with the recent weeks of protests, it is a sort of hit and run, cat and mouse, be water philosophy to how these protests are happening. They may be organized on messaging apps and online, but it's only when people get down to the streets that they communicate verbally, and no one is allowed to take control or represent really the intentions or what the protesters want to say and do. It is all sort of organized organically. So even figures you may know of, like Joshua Wong, they do statements on Twitter and this kind of thing. They speak to the international media about what's happening, but no one daren't take ownership over the movement. And certainly Democrats even today were, talking about and expressing some condemnation as to what was happening in the airport yesterday. But there is a sense that everything, no matter what happens, needs to remain united in terms of the opposition in Hong Kong. Because it really did fragment after the 2014 pro-democracy umbrella movement. And no matter how hairy things get, people are a little reluctant to criticize even the frontline, more violent protesters at the moment. So I don't see any figure in the middle ground at the moment.
Okay, Tom, we will speak again, I'm sure. Tom Grundy, Editor-in-Chief of the Hong Kong Free Press. It's a pretty grim picture there, and no sign so far of anything becoming any less brittle when it comes to that relationship between protesters. And as he says, there's no one protester or protesting group. It's sort of a range, a spectrum of different ideas, a bit like what's going on in France in that respect.
Absolutely.
Perhaps with more potentially sinister consequences there in China.